and start recording this. So just go ahead and relax, and then we'll begin. Inhale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exhale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Inhale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exhale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Inhale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exhale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Inhale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exhale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And just keep breathing just like that. You don't have to think about it too much, but just continue to breathe comfortably, allowing your body to relax onto the chair, feeling more and more relaxed with each breath. And then we'll begin. Now, you may remember from last week, we concluded as you had fled your plantation, slave to a master that treated everyone around you awful, and you found a way out. And so today, our story begins where you found your freedom, escaping to the north. And even though free and independent Black folks are becoming more prominent, especially in the north, historians still estimate that there are around 6 to 7 million enslaved people that were imported to the New World simply during the 18th century alone. So from 1719 to 1819, nearly 7 million people were taken from their homes in Africa and transported to this continent. This action itself deprived the African continent of its most valuable resource, its healthiest and ablest men and women, those who had knowledge, who had education, who had skills, were taken from their homes and brought here to use those skills. Now, I like to start out with quotes before we get into the stories. People say that slaves were taken from Africa. This is not true. People were taken from Africa, among them healers and priests, and all were made into slaves. Abdullah Ibrahim. If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. Martin Luther King Jr. Thus far, I had outwitted him, and I had triumphed over it, she said, standing on the stage. Who can blame slaves for being cunning? They are constantly compelled to resort to it. It is the only weapon of the weak and oppressed against the strength of their tyrants. Harriet Ann Jacobs. And the last person to step onto the stage gives a powerful oration as you sit in the crowd in this theater among mostly other Black folks, but some white folks peppered in. Frederick Douglass takes the stage and begins his oration. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial and hypocritical religion of the land. I look upon it as the climax of all misnomers, the boldest of all frauds, the grossest of all libels. Never was there a clearer case of stealing the livery of the court of heaven to serve the devil within. I am filled with unutterable loathing when I contemplate the religious pomp and show together with the horrible inconsistencies which everywhere surround me. We have men stealers for ministers, women whippers for missionaries, and cradle plunderers for church members. The man who wields the blood-clotted cowskin during the week fills the pulpit on Sunday and claims to be a minister of the meek and lowly Jesus. The slave auctioneer's bell and the church-going bell chime in with each other, and the bitter cries of the heartbroken slave are drowned in the religious shouts of his pious master. Revivals of religion and revivals in the slave trade go hand in hand together. The slave prison and the church stand near each other. The clanking of fetters and the rattling of chains in the prison, and the pious psalm and solemn prayer in the church may be heard at the same time. The dealers in bodies of men erect their stand in the presence of the pulpit, and they mutually help each other. The dealer gives his blood-stained gold to support the pulpit, and the pulpit, in return, covers his infernal business with the garb of religion. Here we have religion and robbery, the allies of each other, devils dressed in angels' robes, and hell presenting the semblance of paradise. The words were powerful, and maybe they stuck with you as you left that meeting, stepping out into the fresh air of the north, chillier than what you remember, or chillier than what you are accustomed to. And you just contemplate everything you just heard. Now, 1721, there are more Black men enslaved than there are white men free in Louisiana. And you know this because that is where you came from the plantation of your master, fleeing from the dogs, saved by the black pepper you put in your sock. You had grown accustomed to your freedom, enjoying it. But even in freedom, there was still oppression for you and your people. Sure, you could walk around now without a pass, not having to worry about the patrollers that routinely found and beat Black folks that traveled along the roads without a pass. And you remember a story of another slave you'd met recently, now a friend. His story was so interesting you recall it to yourself. He said, I was born in Dukandara in Guinea, somewhere around the year 1729. My father's name was Sangum Furo, prince of the tribe of Dukandara. My father had 3 wives. Polygamy was not uncommon in that country, especially among the rich, as every man was allowed to keep as many wives as he could maintain. But his first wife, he had 3 children, the eldest of whom, myself, named by my father, Brotir. The other 2 were named Kundazo and Suzaduka. My father had 2 children by his second wife, and 1 by his third wife. I descended from a very large and tall, stout race of beings, much larger than the generality of people in the other parts of the globe, being commonly considerable, above 6 feet in height, and every way well proportioned. But at a certain time, I and other prisoners were put on board a canoe from our lands, and now under our master, rowed away to a vessel belonging to Rhode Island, commanded by Captain Collingwood and the mate Thomas Mumford. While we were going to our vessel, our master told us all to appear to the best possible advantage for sail. I was brought on board by one Robertson Mumford, steward of said vessel, for 4 gallons of rum and a piece of calico. I was bonded, and they called me Venture on account of his having to purchase me with his own private venture. Thus I came by my new name. All the slaves that were brought for that vessel's cargo were 260. After an ordinary passage, except a great mortality by the smallpox, which broke out on board, we arrived at the island of Barbados. But when we reached it, there we were found out that the 260 of us that had sailed from Africa, not more than 200 were alive. And these were all sold, except myself and 3 more, to the planters there. Captain Collingwood and the mate Thomas Mumford would take me round the Caribbean islands, while we would sell other slaves, buy up other ventures, and otherwise create more money for my new master. After nearly 10 years of doing this, I had saved up enough money, and Captain Collingwood offered to sell me my freedom for $50, a significant sum at the time. So I took all my money, everything that I had saved over 10 years, and I showed it to Captain Collingwood. And he denied it, saying You must have $25 more to get your freedom, for now you sail. And so, for another year, I would sail to the New World and the Caribbean islands. And finally, came into good luck as I found something with quite a lot of money and was able to sell it for $10, giving me just the right amount of money I needed to buy my freedom. I didn't hate Captain Collingwood. The work was hard. It took me a while to find my sea legs, but I learned a lot. And when we parted ways, I knew I would miss that life to some extent. But nothing was better than my freedom. And right then, you arrive to your new house in the north, if you can call it a house. It was more of a shanty next to many other shanties, barely able to even hold themselves up. These buildings housed most of the black folks that were free in your area. There were no chimneys, there were no stoves. You would make a fire outside and cook with everyone else around you. Oftentimes, people pitching in so that they could all eat a more hearty meal. But you also know that your freedom inspires others to freedom. And even though freedom doesn't feel quite as grand as you had hoped, and oppression is still oppression. In the South, the slaves were starting to uprise more, now seeing thousands of free blacks living in the North, or hearing stories of other black folks that had escaped their plantations and bondage. By 1739, one of the earliest slave revolts occurs in Charleston, South Carolina. It's a black majority colony, South Carolina. Blacks having more numbers than the whites in South Carolina combined. And at this point, slavery is becoming less popular. And this rebellion, the Stono Rebellion, leads to the deaths of at least 20 white folks and 40 black. And this begins to scare the Southerners. Prior to these times, prior to freed Africans, there weren't a lot of uprising or revolts. But there's even more going on in the culture that shifts these tides. Lucy Terry is one of the earliest known authors of a literature by an African American. Her words sold, and people read them, read her stories of what it was like to be a slave on the plantations. white folks read her stories. And there's something interesting about people. When you actually put yourself into somebody's shoes, you gain clarity in who they are and why they are. And as more stories from freed slaves begin to be published and told, the more white folks begin to become pro-emancipation. Lucy Terry herself gained her freedom in Massachusetts in 1756. And even though great progress has already been made, oppression still stands. The New York slave conspiracy trials take place as officials accuse 34 people of attempting to burn down New York City. But this was common tactics for anybody that tried to help or assist slaves in escaping, to convict them of something they hadn't done, to ensure they inspired no one else. And so 13 Black men are burned at the stake, and 17 Black men, 2 white men, and 2 white women are hanged. Over the next 30 years, from 1741 to 1772, a lot would occur. Leading up to the Revolutionary War, tensions were at a max. And things have a funny way of working like dominoes. As one falls over, so does the next. But in some cases, you may not see exactly how they fall. In 1772, you read about a judge sitting in the High Court of London. He declared slavery so odious that it could not exist at common law, and he set the conditions, which would consequently result in the freedom of 15,000 slaves living in England. This decision eventually reached America, and terrified slaveholders and collection of British colonies were subject to British law. The predominantly Southern slave owners feared that this decision would cause the emancipation of their property. And it did result in some slaves freeing themselves. Now remember, at this time, the United States is still part of Britain. So when laws occur in Britain, they're passed to the United States. And while the Tea Party was a good story for why or how the revolution began, it wasn't really tea that fueled the Revolutionary War. Or at the very minimum, not just tea, not just independence. The Revolutionary War was partly fought to ensure the preservation of slavery. The Southern colonies joined the Northerners in their fight for freedom and the rebellion against England. In 1774, at the First Continental Congress, John Adams promised Southern leaders that he would support their right to maintain slavery, their right. The price of freedom from England was bondage for African slaves in America, and America would become a slave nation. And so, as the tensions rise, you do what you can to abate the stress that's welling within. Phyllis Wheatley's poem, titled Poems on Various Subjects, Religion and Moral, is the first full book published by an African American author. And delving into the poems gives you a different perspective. And you start to really think about how all of these tie in. And if there's a way to help other slaves free themselves as you had freed yourself. But at this point, the white folks in power realize that the black slaves are a chip they can use for betting, they can use for gambling. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia in 1773, threatened that he would proclaim liberty to the slaves and reduce Williamsburg to ashes if the colonists resorted to force against British authority. By November of 1773, he had promised freedom to all slaves belonging to rebels who would join His Majesty's troops, for the more speedily reducing the colony to a proper sense of their duty. Some 800 slaves joined the British forces. Some even bore the emblem, liberty to the slaves. The British appeal to the slave unrest outraged the slaveholders, not only in the South, but in New York's Hudson Valley. And later still, Sir Henry Clinton promised protection to all slaves who deserted from the rebels, and Clinton's promise may well have contributed to the collapse of the British cause in the South by suggesting that the revolution was a war over slavery. He alienated many neutrals and even some who were loyal to the crown. And so they play them against each other. We'll give you freedom if you fight for us. But were they still really free? Given their bodies to a war, and maybe all they wanted was just to go home. And meanwhile, an American diplomat in 1773, Silas Deane, hatched a secret plan to incite slave insurrections in Jamaica. Two South Carolinians, John Laurens and his father Henry, persuaded Congress to unanimously approve a plan to recruit an army of 3,000 slave troops in the South Carolina and Georgia. The federal government would even compensate these slaves' owners. And in turn, each black slave would, at the end of the war, be emancipated and receive $50. The South Carolina legislature rejected the plan, scuttling the proposal. In the end, though, and in contrast to the later Latin American wars for independence and the US Civil War, neither the British nor the Americans proved willing to risk a full-scale social revolution by issuing an Emancipation Proclamation. And as you think about this, they could have solved the problem in one fell swoop, freeing the slaves. But they wanted that power still. They desired that power. Power over people, a helpless people. And just before the Revolutionary War would begin, 5,000 enslaved and free African Americans would fight for the side of the Patriots, including two predominantly Black units in Massachusetts, one in Connecticut and one in Rhode Island. Now, these times were some of the most difficult for the Black folks. Not only were they being used as pawns unwittingly, but they would be forced to fight a war, forced to fight a war that they really had no idea what was going on. Sure, you could say they were fighting for their freedom, but at the end of the Revolutionary War, emancipation was not granted to all Blacks, only to a handful, and that's assuming they weren't in the South still. The war was devastating. And men in the Black units would find themselves without hardly any equipment whatsoever. No tents, no cannons. They were given the bare minimum. They would sleep on the ground with just a bedroll and nothing else. And this lasted for years as they fought. But in their valiant efforts, the Revolutionary War was won. But that didn't mean that the Blacks were safe or even free. Because by 1780, slavery becomes synonymous with sugar and cotton. From North America to South America to the Caribbean to Australia, the commodity is grown using slave labor or other forms of coerced labor. Sugar becomes England's dominant import from the mid-18th century to the 19th. This in turn fuels the Atlantic slave trade, which helps to build the international trade system. And slaves, still in bondage in the South especially, would share their stories. Maybe you remember a somewhat whimsical story told by an old man as you sat around the fire one night, waiting for dinner, the fire crackling, the smell of fresh cooked food on the grill or pan, a somewhat warm evening. And he starts off with a laugh. All Negro slaves were believers in ghosts, supernatural powers, tokens and signs. Maybe you disagree at first, but he's very convincing. Just listen. Listen to this story. A turkey gobbler had mysteriously disappeared from one of the neighboring plantations, and the local slaves were accused of cooking the gobbler for dinner. A slave was convicted of theft, and he was severely punished. As all the slaves denied any knowledge of the turkey's whereabouts, they were forced to make search of an entire plantation. On one part of the place, there was a large peach orchard. And at the base of each tree, there was a large cabinet, or what we called a safe. One of the slaves was looking through the orchard and by accident opened up the lid to one of these safes. And behold, there was a gobbler, peacefully seated on a number of green peaches. The Negro immediately ran to his master and notified him of discovery. The master returned to the orchard with the slave to find that the Negro's wild tale was true. He couldn't believe it. A turkey gobbler sitting on a nest of green peaches. How silly is that? But the master had a son, and he had taken seriously ill some time before the turkey disappeared. And a few days after this unusual event with the turkey, the son died. And after his death, the word of the turkey's nesting spread to the four winds. And for some time after the story was related wherever there was a public gathering. And after that, all the slaves said that the green peaches was a bad omen. And if a turkey went near them, they'd be running for the hills. There were lots of stories like that. The slaves were very superstitious. He smiled in the firelight, bringing an orange glow to his cheeks, a few missing teeth, and few hairs on his head. In 1781, you read a story about a man, Captain Collingwood. He was a slave trader. You remember earlier, your friend, Venture, referred to Captain Collingwood. But in this one that you'll read, made you sick. made your stomach turn, and tears well in your eyes. The headline read, Captain Collingwood throws 132 sick Africans off the slave ship Zong in order to collect insurance money for them. This man pushed 132 people off of a boat so he could claim them for his insurance. What kind of person does it take to do something so horrific? But this incident helps galvanize support for the movement against the Atlantic slave trade. By 1791, as the growth of the cotton industry led inexorably to an increased demand for enslaved Africans, the prospect of slave rebellions began to rise. But the slaves, not really knowing what's going on in Haiti, as the Haitians begin to revolt and unrest begins to increase, slaves had no idea. This old woman recounted a story to you that stuck with you. Her duties were the light chores, which had to be done well, or she was chided the same as the white children would have been. Every evening, the children had to collect eggs. The child who brought in the most eggs would get a ginger cake. Mittie most always got the ginger cake first. She had older brothers and sisters, but she saw that they were treated rough, whipped often and hard. I can't think, much less talk, about their awful treatment. When I was old enough, I would spin wool for my mistress, who wove the cloth to make the family clothes. I also learned to knit, and after supper, I would knit until bedtime. I remember once an old woman slave had displeased a master about something, and he dug a pit. He placed boards over this hole. The woman was made to lie down on the boards face down, and there she was beaten until the blood gushed from her body, and there she would take her last breath. I also remember, though, the good times, the times that we found for ourselves. I remember how we had this cabin out in the woods, and we had got word round to the other plantations, and all the slaves would sneak out or ask if they could get a pass from the master. But they would sneak out for the dances. The dances were quite grand, and we could dance all night. But there were also the patrollers. Patrollers would come by, and if they heard us, they would break it up, beat those that they caught, and take everyone back. So we began to put out scouts to keep watch. And they would let us know when the patrollers were coming, and then we'd all hide. But I remember the music. The music was so nice. You might remember it. You might remember how it filled your spirits. It made you feel human once again. You had a community and people. You had love. And the dancing filled your soul. And those were the times that you once again felt human. And although things are shifting now, in 1793, Congress passes a new law to keep slaves in chains. Congress passes the Fugitive Slave Act, making it a federal crime to assist a slave trying to escape, forcing them to be property. But now discontent among the slaves is reaching an all-time high. There are so many free slaves at this point, Black folks not in chains, that the slaves see it and want it, just as you had wanted it. To break free of those chains around your wrists, to end the times of being tied to the whipping pole. Exhaustion from working in the field 16 hours a day. Fear, never knowing if your life would be taken for the most mundane or the tiniest of mistakes. And that fear led to people wanting a better life. If they could not reason with their masters, then they would fight them. After a 12-year struggle in Haiti, with constant uprisings and revolts, turmoil of all kinds on the little island. After 12 years, the Haitians gained their independence. Thousands of formerly enslaved Africans overcame the British, the Spanish, and Napoleonic French armies to create the first independent Black republic in the Americas. A republic that was motivated by ideas of the French Revolution. And ultimately, this revolution destroyed slavery in the most profitable French colony, hurting the French's ability to expand their own control. And in 1807, the British slave trade is abolished. However, slave traders find other ways to circumvent this new law, and slavery itself remains legal. But in 1808, Congress bans the importation of slaves. And so it is illegal now to take any new Africans to the Americas. This doesn't affect those already here, as they were breeding stock, as it were, and were left to continue to be treated like breeding stock. But stopping the importation of slaves allows Africa to heal itself from the trauma it had suffered. And it allows a different culture to begin to take place as more and more white folks begin to band against slavery. The Quakers are leading this charge. Quakerism gains popularity, and through their efforts, they would help slaves escape their chains. And even though it's still years to come before Harriet Tubman would create the Underground Railroad, these early efforts by the Quakers are essential in freeing the Black folks. And so, you laid down that night, not truly comfortable, if you're honest with yourself, on your bed, but it is yours. It is your home. And you begin to think about all of the experiences you have had. You could be free of everything. You don't have to fight. You gained your freedom. Let the others gain their freedom. But there's a nagging question that just won't leave you be. After Frederick Douglass's speech earlier, you just could not get it out of your head. What do we owe to each other? What do we owe to our society? Do we owe to be good people? To not steal? To not hurt? What do we owe to each other? Support, help, love, kindness, compassion, empathy. The words swirl inside your head. And even though it seems to chase you like a dog, nipping at your heels, there's some kind of comfort in it. What do we owe each other? And then you drift off. Now just begin to notice the bottoms of your feet and wiggle your toes slightly to kind of wake them up. And then we'll move up the legs. So to your calves, your knees, your thighs, your waist, noticing your stomach and chest, your shoulders, then down the arms to the fingertips, and just wiggle your fingers, waking them up, getting the blood moving. Then move up to your neck, your chin and jaw, the forehead, and then the top of your head. And when you are ready, you can open your eyes if they're still closed, and you can return to the room. Thank you all for joining me again this week, the second week of the Black History Month event. I hope you will join us next week, where next week we'll talk about the migration of Jim Crow. So at the turn of the 19th century and into the 20th century, and what that was like for Black folks. So I hope you'll join us then. We'll be posting that link in the chat. If you have time, we would really appreciate you to just fill out the short survey. Otherwise, have a wonderful evening, and we hope to see you next week. Thank you.